A damp veil clung to the skin between her shoulder blades, like a second, quivering spine. The room was full of men, eyes in uniforms, hands in rings, breath tasting of cigars and desire. Mata Hari spun slowly, as if a mechanism ticked in her temple, each movement a delayed explosion. Silk slithered from her hip a moment too late. She knew where silence roared louder than music, and a glance weighed heavier than touch. You don't hear the words, but you feel them assessing her, gauging her price. She was not a person, but an object on the display window of empires. They sought in her a weakness that could be bought and a beauty for which one could kill. Later, they would say she played too dangerously, that she was a spy, or perhaps just a woman too free for a time too masculine. But for now, she danced, and no one knew who led, her or the verdict. The story would begin that evening, under the gaze of those who would one day order her removed. And all that would remain would be the veil, soaked not only in sweat, but in fear. Every 20th century officer desired to possess her. They wrote her letters, invited her to balls, spun legends about her gaze. And yet, she who the world knew as Mata Hari was once just a girl named Greet, with thick black hair, tanned skin, and almond-shaped eyes that reflected not the heavens, but the expectations of others. Before the eastern veils became her armor, before the stages where she twirled like a mandala in flames, she sat in a carriage pulled by goats, a gift from her father. A little princess of the Dutch town of Leeuwarden, absurd, impossible, and therefore especially memorable. Margarita's father, Adam Zell, was a hatmaker with grand ambitions and a theatrical flair for luxury. He made his money on the stock market, invested in dreams, and gambled as if fate were a card game. He had a talent for appearances. In the eyes of his neighbors, he was wealthy, generous, noble, almost a gentleman, but without the title. And perhaps that's why his daughter absorbed the most important lesson: appearance is currency. Margarita grew up amidst mirrors, fabrics, and the theater of domestic illusions. She was called Greet, the only girl among 3 brothers, and even then she knew how to be special. 6 years old, in her goat-drawn carriage, she rode down Grootkerkstraat, royally, as if every cobblestone bowed. Their house was the largest on the square, a facade with columns, grand staircases, the scent of polished wood. Success allowed the family to live with a lavishness that didn't match their origins or the stability of their income. But this fairy tale didn't last long. In 1889, when Greet was only 13, her father went bankrupt. The goats disappeared, the carriage rotted, the house was sold. All that remained was dust, longing, and silence, the 3 constant companions of ruin. The family was scattered like leaves in an autumn storm. Her mother, Antje, soon passed away after a prolonged illness. Her father moved to Amsterdam with their 2 sons, beginning a new life and a new family. And Margarita found herself in the hands of relatives, scattered across various branches. This was her first lesson in fragility, not of illusion, but of reality itself. Where yesterday there had been silks and sweets, now there were stern aunts, deaf walls, and an upbringing by the rules. She lived with her godfather, a strict burgher, and soon found herself in Leiden, where they tried to make her a governess. A noble idea, boring, safe, everything that didn't suit Margarita's spirit. She didn't linger in this new world. The reasons for her departure are shrouded in fog. Some whispered of a scandal with the director, others of an unfair punishment, but the fact remained: she left forever. And this became the second crack in her persona. Now she knew how to escape. Thus the cocoon was formed, a shell in which a delicate soul, fleeing betrayal, loss, and limitations, hid. Her identity was not a sequence of events, but a series of reinventions. And perhaps, if it weren't for poverty, if it weren't for the pain of loss, if her father hadn't traded the carriage for debts, Mata Hari wouldn't have been born. But Greet existed, and in that girl, even then, lived a thirst for the stage. Not the stage of the theater, but the stage of life, where every glance is a bow, where every gesture is a challenge. At 19, she met a man who seemed to her like a way out. Not a prince, no, but a ticket. His name was Rudolph Johannes MacLeod. He was 20 years her senior, an officer in the Dutch colonial army, lame and surly, but with a uniform and a pension. For Margarita, he was a chance to leave the world of gray streets where a girl with a past could no longer hide. She agreed quickly, almost carelessly. The wedding was held in July 1895, and a year later they had a son. But if marriage was her escape, then her new life quickly became a prison. First they settled in Rudolph's sister's house, then they moved. Then they traveled to the other end of the world, to the Dutch East Indies, to the island of Java. One would think exoticism, sun, palm trees. But Java greeted her not with an oriental fairy tale, but with humid heat, the boredom of garrison evenings, and her husband's endless irritation. He was jealous of her, of the world, of the mirror, of every glance. He reproached her for her extravagance, her audacity, her theatrical brilliance, which she couldn't and didn't want to extinguish. She stung him with words, sarcastically, sharply, as she knew how. This marriage was not a union, but a slow burning. And yet, in the heart of Java, she stepped onto a stage for the first time. In honor of the accession of the young Queen Wilhelmina, the local society staged a play, and Margarita played the role of the queen. A simple amateur performance, but she felt it. Applause, though rare, silenced the scream within. Here in Malong, she began to try on images, masks, costumes. Even then, she understood when she danced, she was free. While she searched for a stage, fate continued to deliver blows. In 1898, they had a daughter, Jean Louise, nicknamed Nun. And the following year, a tragedy occurred that no one liked to talk about. Their young son, Norman, died. Rumors, confessions, gossip. They say he was poisoned by a servant out of revenge. Apparently, her father, Rudolph, had offended the servant's husband, and she decided to punish not him, but the child. There are other versions, but Margarita, a young mother, buried not only her son, she buried the remnants of trust in this life.
The child's death was the final crack. Her husband became even more somber, and she even more rebellious. They were driven apart as if a ship were shattering on the rocks. She wanted to return to Europe. He feared poverty. In the end, in March 1902, they returned to the Netherlands, settled with his sister in Amsterdam, but no longer as a family, but as two people sharing square meters and grievances. The court granted them separate living. Rudolph didn't pay alimony, and Margarita was left alone, penniless, without support, with a child in her arms and a body that still remembered the stage. And she did what a woman with nothing left to lose does. She left for Paris, a city where you can start everything anew if you have at least a legend. First, with a dream of becoming a model, then a model for artists, then a circus rider. Paris didn't accept her immediately. It wanted novelty, and she only had despair. She returned, then went again. Persistence, hunger, and imagination, these were her three allies. Between her failures, she invented a trick, a dance. Not ballet, not vaudeville, but an exotic illusion. A dance with a veil in which a woman seemed to shed not clothes, but past lives. She composed it herself, the movements, the costume, even the legend. According to her version, she was a temple dancer from South India, born into the Brahmin caste, trained in sacred rituals from childhood. One day, she recounted, a British officer saw her in the temple and took her with him to Europe. Thus began this fairy tale. Of course, none of it was true. But the public didn't ask. The public believed their eyes, and the eyes saw a miracle, a figure wrapped in translucent fabrics, gestures that were both prayer and defiance. She chose a stage name, Mata Hari. In Malay, it means sun or eye of the day. The name was short, mysterious, with the scent of distant lands, perfect. Paris of the Belle Epoque craved exoticism. Chinese porcelain, Japanese prints, Javanese masks were adored here. And there were almost no real Oriental dancers, let alone those who knew how to control the audience's attention like Mata Hari.
She wasn't a dancer, but a phenomenon. Her image didn't just sell, it generated current, vibration, electrification. Reporters wrote about her with bated breath. She was captivating. Smooth movements, a gaze, veils falling away to music. It wasn't a dance, it was a consecration. Not to religion, no, but to the cult of a woman in control of herself. She created not just a number, she built a myth. And like all great myths, it was born not from luxury, but from pain and the need to be heard. Interestingly, despite her years in Indonesia, she knew almost nothing about Indian rituals or true dance techniques. All she used was intuition and books popular in Europe at the time, but no one checked for authenticity. That was the secret of her success. In a world that craved the exotic, she offered not reality, but its vivid, dramatic reflection. She became a living postcard from a non-existent country. And Paris, weary of boredom, wanted this illusion. Thus, Mata Hari entered high society. She was invited to receptions, charity events, private dinners. She performed not in theaters, but in private salons for those who ruled empires. The former wife of a disgraced Dutch officer transformed into a mysterious priestess from the south. And although it was all a deception, everyone who saw her willingly participated in this deception, because her dance held not truth, but a yearning for a miracle. Her true birth didn't happen in Holland, nor in marriage, not even in Java. Mata Hari was born on March 13, 1905, at the Guimet Museum, among columns and rarities, before a select audience craving Oriental mystery. Industrialist Émile Guimet hosted an evening, and Margarita, no longer Zell, no longer MacLeod, but the legend personified, walked into the hall. She danced in semi-darkness, almost naked, wrapped in veils that disappeared one by one like memories. Her movements were not technical, but precise, not complex, but hypnotic. What she did on stage couldn't be replicated. It could only be absorbed. From that moment, Mata Hari's true story began. In the same year, 1905, she gave 35 performances, each a sellout. Every evening brought her 10,000 francs, a colossal sum even by Parisian standards. She rented apartments in millionaires' quarters, lived in luxurious hotels, wore jewels as casually as other women wear gloves. She was desired. Dukes, industrialists, ministers invited her. Her body was a work of art, her name a password to pleasure. But it was more than seduction. She was not just a woman. She was a symbol of something lost and magical. Freedom, contradiction, a dream. Every appearance was accompanied by rumors. Now she was going to marry an Eastern European prince. Now she was going to Sicily for inspiration. Now she was quitting the stage forever. These announcements were often lies, but clever lies. Mata Hari played on expectations. She knew how society worked. To maintain interest, you had to disappear. Her biography changed from interview to interview. Sometimes she was the granddaughter of an Indonesian Raja. Sometimes an orphan raised in a monastery. Sometimes the daughter of a Brahmin and a Spaniard. She forged not documents, but the very essence of her past, and the public greedily consumed every crumb.
But behind the glitter, cracks. The divorce from MacLeod was officially finalized in 1906, and although society didn't know all the details, they were unpleasant. His sister circulated scandalous photographs of a nude Margarita. In court, it became an argument against her. In the newspaper, a spicy piece of gossip. The court found her guilty of breaking up the marriage, while public opinion simultaneously made her a heroine. And here lies the paradox of Mata Hari. She was condemned for immorality and adored for the very same immorality. After Paris, there was Vienna, another triumph. Then Monte Carlo, where she played the role of Cleopatra. The costumes became bolder, the movements slower, the glances more lingering. Her dance became a meditation on desire. The press compared her to myths. She didn't just dance, she radiated ritual. And yet, drama, an inner anxiety that only the most attentive saw. The woman who strode across the stage already felt how fragile the ice was beneath her heels. In December 1906, she appeared in Berlin. The sensation became a sensation. She stayed in a hotel so close to the imperial palace that you could almost reach out and touch it. And when she was invited to dance before Kaiser Wilhelm II and his family, it marked the pinnacle, but simultaneously the beginning of the end. The higher you climb, the louder the fall. Even then, rumors began to circulate. Who is she? Where is she from? Why are so many prominent men around her? Why does she speak German with such an accent, as if it were her native tongue? She responded in her own way.
A new version of her past appeared in the press. Her father was a military man. She was a graduate of a boarding school in Wiesbaden. Beautiful but unsubstantiated. Her real life drowned in legends. Meanwhile, her father, Adam Zell, published a brochure telling his daughter's story, embellished, falsified, almost comical. He too wanted a share of the glory. Another person turning her into a symbol, against her will. In late 1907, Mata Hari disappeared from the European stage. They said she went to Egypt, or simply got tired, or realized the fairy tale was beginning to crumble. She returned to Paris as a star, but the city had changed a bit. In her absence, new names, new bodies, new exotic tales had emerged. Imitation quickly replaces the original, and even the most fabricated myth grows old. But Mata Hari didn't give up. She knew that interest had to be fed with scandal, mystery, the effect of disappearance. Her dance became a rarity. She appeared at private parties of bankers, ministers, aristocrats, dancing for those who paid for the right to see. Not a performance, a privilege. Not art, access. To stay afloat, she turned every gesture into a strategy. She wrote to the press, planted rumors, behaved like a piece of chessboard on a social life. She no longer aspired to be just an artist. She was building herself as an image, strong, unpredictable, desired, and dangerous. Even announcements of her career ending were part of the game. Now she was leaving forever. Now she was preparing for a wedding with a prince who didn't exist. Newspapers savored it. The public believed. Rivals envied. In this game, she was alone against the world, and she held her ground with regal composure.
But physical fatigue took its toll. Age, injuries, competition. By 1910, her dance no longer evoked the same delight. Directors noticed her technique was weak, her plastique outdated, the dramaturgy of her persona predictable. When she received the role of Cleopatra in Monte Carlo, everything was supposed to be a new triumph, but the performance didn't go as planned. The director was dissatisfied. She offended. A public and painful conflict erupted. The legal proceedings dragged on until the end of 1911, and although Mata Hari won, she lost more: the respect of the stage. In these years, she began to gradually disappear. Not physically, socially, in the media. Other names surfaced, younger bodies, bolder and fresher. Paris, like all cities of grand illusions, forgets quickly. She had one ally left, the banker Xavier Rousseau. He not only helped her financially, he gave her a sense of a secure base. In his company, she rested from the eternal struggle. But even this was temporary. In 1912, she tried to get a job with Sergei Diaghilev. It seemed the Russian impresario would appreciate such an exotic image. But the meeting ended in humiliation. She was considered outdated, ridiculous, even vulgar. This was a blow. Not from critics, not from the public, but from professional art. Her myth didn't fit into the updated avant-garde. Dance was no longer a romantic mystery. It became technique, modernism, concept. And Mata Hari remained a figure from the previous decade, a living artifact of the Belle Époque. And yet, she didn't give up. She tried to regain the stage, to offer herself to new producers, to find those niches where her name still resonated. She even tried to reunite with her daughter, Jean-Louise, but the attempts were unsuccessful. The girl lived with her father, and the door to her was tightly shut. In 1913, she went to Berlin again, another attempt to revive her career. There were performances, but without that brilliance, without that magic. The public, tired of its own fears, no longer wanted to dream. The world was approaching war, and in this new rhythm, Mata Hari's dance sounded like an aria from another time. Shadows gathered on the horizon. World War I would break out, and her veils would become not a symbol of passion, but a reminder of a world that was about to disappear, and with it, her. But while the war hadn't yet begun, she continued, stubbornly, proudly, beautifully. Performances, letters, promotional posters, even postcards with her image, they still sold. But there was no longer anticipation in them. There was nostalgia. Too beautiful to disappear, too restless to stay. Mata Hari was entering the final act of her drama and didn't even suspect that the stage was already set. Only it wouldn't be a theater stage, but a tribunal.
Performances almost ceased, not because interest in her disappeared. Interest in everything disappeared. Who could afford the luxury of watching a woman shed veils to Oriental music when hundreds died at the borders every day? Mata Hari found herself superfluous. She didn't realize it immediately. She continued to write, search for stages, propose programs. But gradually, the realization dawned. They no longer wanted to see her. Her world of balls, imperial palaces, society parties had burned down, along with her costumes, posters, and fame. She fled to The Hague, renting a modest house, without servants, without pearls, without the spotlight. Life became colorless, and Margarita, the same one who once rode in a carriage pulled by goats, found herself alone with emptiness. Money melted away. Banknotes, like veils, disappeared one by one. She tried to sell her belongings to return to Paris via London, but the world had become closed. Without a visa, without connections, without a purpose, she darted between countries like an actress who had forgotten her role. In Amsterdam, she stayed at the Victoria Hotel, once frequented by diplomats and artists, now by soldiers and refugees. There, she began a short romance with the banker Wil van der Schalk. She introduced herself to him as a Russian émigré fleeing the revolution. It was another mask. But when he learned who she really was, he left. Her name no longer captivated, it alerted. It smelled of scandal, ruin, and the past. And then he appeared, Vadim Maslov, a Russian officer, 21 years old, handsome, wounded, young. She fell in love. Was it real love or a desperate attempt to feel warmth again, to be needed, to be saved? We don't know. But one thing is certain, he was her last anchor. He went to the front, and rumor has it, lost an eye in battle. They say it was the desire to help him with his treatment, to get money, to arrange hospitalization, that pushed her to the edge beyond which the spy drama begins. She was still a figure from another world, but it was precisely this that made her a potential liaison. A woman who had been to Berlin, Paris, Vienna, danced before the Kaiser and French generals, spoke several languages and mastered the art of seduction. She was the ideal envoy. Or at least, so others decided. Who first made her the offer, Germans or French, is unknown. But something else is known. She accepted the money. 20,000 francs from the German consul in Amsterdam, Karl Kramer. Was the money proof or a trap? She claimed, yes, she received it, but she passed on nothing to anyone. She agreed, out of desperation, but did not act. Or did she act? The investigation would later build the entire accusation around this sum. And yet, at that moment, perhaps she herself didn't know how far it would lead. The threads began to tighten. Her past became evidence, and any trip suspicion. Her name a danger. She was entering the last invisible scene of her life, unaware that the role had already been written, and there would be no applause.
In the late autumn of 1915, Mata Hari, tired, forgotten, surrounded by shadows, finally decided. At the suggestion of German intelligence, she traveled to Cologne to receive instructions. Walter Nicolai, head of the intelligence service, personally spoke with her. Did he see her as a valuable resource or just a glamorous wrapper to be conveniently used? Unknown. But the decision was made. She was enlisted under the code name H-21. The task, to gather information in France, transmit it through agents in Madrid and Düsseldorf. And she agreed. Not because she was a loyal agent, rather a desperate woman. Without a stage, without money, without love. She was seduced not by ideals, but by need. She was sure she could control the game. She would use all sides without giving herself to any. After all, she was used to it, being on stage, changing masks, deceiving. She thought espionage was also theater. But that was a mistake. In intelligence, there were no spectators, only executioners. In December, she returned to Paris under a pretext to collect furniture. She stayed at the Grand Hotel, attracting attention, meeting influential men. Among them, former Minister of War Adolphe Massimi, diplomat Jules Cambon, official Jean Halau. These were connections that could provide access to rumors, plans, strategies. Perhaps everything she heard was idle chatter. Perhaps there was not a drop of real information in these conversations. But from an intelligence perspective, she was already a leak, or bait. On December 28, she telegraphed German Captain Hoffmann. No major offensive from the French side was expected. The message was simple, almost banal, but it became decisive. The telegram, sent in code, intercepted, deciphered by British intelligence, became the stone that moved the avalanche. The British passed the data to the French. The hunt began. But while Paris prepared for her arrest, Mata Hari was already in Spain. There, in Madrid, she stayed at the Palace Hotel, where French diplomats, German agents, and Austrian journalists mingled in the lobby. A noisy babble of war. She met with Arnold Kalle, a German intelligence officer. And again, she transmitted information, or pretended to, or she was simply used. This time, Kalle sent a report to Amsterdam, stating, Agent H-21 is working, requesting money and new tasks. In theory, a formality. In practice, a death sentence. Because this telegram was also intercepted. And not just the text, the fact was recorded. The woman known as Mata Hari was acting in Germany's interests. That was enough. Everything she did afterwards didn't matter. Letters, explanations, justifications. The system had already decided who she was. Now, it was just a matter of fitting reality to the desired scenario.
Her return to France turned into a trap. French intelligence kept a close eye on her. She was followed. Her walks, meetings, even visits to a fortune teller were recorded. She became an object. The myth that once inspired poets was now a dossier, but direct evidence was still lacking. And then they set a trap.
In December 1916, Major Georges Ledoux provided her with a list of agents, 6 names. One of them was soon killed by the Germans. The rest disappeared. In the eyes of intelligence, this meant one thing: Mata Hari had leaked the information. No one proved it directly, but in the logic of wartime, suspicion was already a sentence. Later, another message arrived in Paris from the German embassy in Madrid. Agent H21 was mentioned again. Again, requests for money, new instructions. All this confirmed the prosecution's version. To cap it off, a check for 5,000 francs from Consul Kramer. An official payment, essentially a bullet with a signature. She still didn't know her time was running out. She continued to believe it was just a misunderstanding, or, as she later said, "I wanted to be Mata Hari, a dancer, not a spy." But in this world, women with a past are not allowed to choose. She thought she was still playing, but the game had long ended. On February 13, 1917, in the semi-darkness of a winter Paris, a figure in furs appeared at the door of the Élysée Hotel. She didn't know she was going to her last meeting with the illusion of freedom. Commissioner Priol met her, politely, almost courteously, but with a weapon. Mata Hari, once the mistress of balls and stages, was arrested and taken to the Palais de Justice, without theatre, without spectators, only a cold corridor and the clatter of heels on stone. She was placed in Sainte-Pelagie prison, first a common cell, then cell number 12, where other women suspected of collaboration with the enemy had been held before her. The cell was cramped, damp, with an iron bed and a peephole in the door. She wrote letters, at first almost daily, to the judge, lawyers, her daughter. The letters were full of despair, justifications, attempts to explain not her actions, but her motives. She didn't consider herself guilty. She considered herself a victim of a world that doesn't forgive mistakes, of men who first desire and then judge, of newspapers that turn any woman into a monster if it sells circulation. The indictment was filed 5 months later. The trial began on July 24th. The hearings were held behind closed doors, supposedly for secrecy, in reality, out of shame. Not a single fact presented by the prosecution was irrefutable. There were no photographs, no documents with her signature, only money, telegrams, rumors, and a name that had become too loud to forgive. The judge, Captain Pierre Boucardon, strict, ambitious, determined. He saw a chance in this case to defeat not just Mata Hari, but the very image of a woman out of control. She was defended by Édouard Clunet, an artistic lawyer, more accustomed to cases of actors and poets than military tribunals. He tried to turn the case into a drama of compassion. He showed how she was used, how she didn't understand what she was getting into. He spoke of love, poverty, confusion, but no one wanted to listen. In 1917, France needed culprits, symbols,
sacrifices on whom to demonstrate betrayal will be punished. The main accusation became her admission that she had passed the names of several agents to the Germans, although she claimed the data was outdated, harmless, no longer relevant. It's a fine line between playing and treason, but the court didn't blur this line. Moreover, they used everything: her knowledge of German, her honeymoon in Wiesbaden, connections with a diplomat, even her costumes, even photographs of her veils were enough for the judges to pass a moral verdict. A woman capable of such a thing is capable of more.
In court, she didn't cry. She looked straight ahead. She spoke clearly. She refused a blindfold. And yet she trembled, not before death, before misunderstanding. She was condemned not for her actions, but for who she had become. Too bright, too free, too foreign. At a time when the country needed clear boundaries, she, a hybrid of cultures, bodies, names, became the perfect enemy. A woman who belonged to everyone automatically belonged to no one, which meant she was dangerous. On July 25, 1917, the verdict was read: death by firing squad, without the possibility of appeal. Not a single minister, not a general, not a former lover spoke out to request a pardon. Silence became the sentence. France, gripped by the fear of defeat, decided to get rid of a myth that had become too inconvenient. In her cell, she learned of this only an hour before the execution. It was customary not to torment with anticipation. She was given paper and a pen. She wrote 3 farewell letters, to her daughter, to Maslov, to a third, unknown. No one knows what was in these letters. Their whereabouts remain unestablished. They disappeared, just as she disappeared, the one they wanted to forget like a bad dream, but remembered as a parable. The morning of October 15, 1917, was cold and windless. At 6:15 a.m., she emerged from Saint-Pelage prison in a simple coat, without adornments, without theater, but with dignity. Mata Hari refused to have her hands bound. She refused a blindfold. She stood straight, looking the soldiers in the eyes. Only a thin rope connected her to the stake, a symbol of obedience she did not accept. It is believed that only one bullet pierced her heart, the rest into the air, into the ground, into fear. Some later said she smiled, someone that she blew a kiss, others that her last words were, "Monsieur, thank you," or "Death is nothing, as is life." The legend had already begun to grow around the body, not yet fallen to the ground. No one claimed her remains. The body was transferred to the medical faculty of the Sorbonne as material. Her head, they say, was preserved and exhibited in an anatomical museum, and then it disappeared. In the 1950s, it simply vanished. No records, no explanations, as if even her death didn't want to be final. Official attempts to review her case have been made several times. In 2001, a petition was filed with the Ministry of Justice. It was rejected. Documents released in the 1970s confirmed, yes, she was listed as Agent H21, but there was no definitive proof that she actually transmitted information. Moreover, retired German General Friedrich Gemp claimed, "I knew nothing about her. In espionage circles, her name was unknown. She was executed not for her actions, but for the possibility, for a symbol, for the anxiety she caused." After her death, she transformed into a myth. Mata Hari became a collective image, a spy, a seductress, a femme fatale. In cinema, sexual and dangerous. In popular culture, almost a feminist icon. Historians still debate, who was she really? An agent, a naive artist, a seeker of love, or a woman who refused to be what they wanted her to be? Perhaps all at once, she was herself and 100 others. She reinvented herself every time, and the world, unable to forgive those who don't fit in, did to her what it always does, first deified, then trampled, then forgot, and then remembered. But in a distorted mirror, she became not a person, but a question. And that question echoes to this day. How many women have been executed, not for guilt, but for the freedom to be inconvenient?